This morning, we are continuing our study in spiritual success or distress. We are in lesson number 11. The title of this lesson is Jesus, the Shepherd Servant. And I would like for you this morning to be turning with me to the Gospel of John, the 10th chapter. The Gospel of John, the 10th chapter. When we think about the Good Shepherd, when we think about the teachings that we have within this context, most of us here understand what a shepherd is about. We understand that a shepherd is one who cares for a flock of sheep, or maybe even a flock of goats. And we live in an area that we understand these things. Now, there are some, I would suggest, that are out there in our viewing audience that might not understand about being a shepherd, about taking care of livestock. But livestock are 100% reliant upon someone to take care of their needs. And I don't care what kind of livestock it is. You know, cattle in the wintertime, they like somebody to come along and bring them a bale of hay or some feed, some range cubes. If you've got a flock of chickens, I guarantee you chickens have a clock. And if you don't get down there and feed the chickens at the right time, you're in trouble. Now, we got a couple of cats that they have clocks. They know when you're supposed to be there, when you're going to come out and feed them. And they're sitting at the back door just impatiently waiting for their food. So whatever it is, it's something that's reliant upon someone. And when we think about Jesus, and as I studied through this lesson, and as I read this passage here in John chapter 10, it brings to light how reliant humanity, every person that's ever been born into this world, is on Jesus. And how Jesus, being the good shepherd, is one that took care of our needs. But also in this series of lessons, we are wanting to emulate, to be like Jesus. We want to be those who take care of one another. We need to shepherd one another. And sometimes there are needs that we have that we need to take the time and make the effort to help others like Jesus helped us. And we need to be reliant on the help that is offered and accept that assistance. So let's look at our outline just a little bit this morning. It says Jesus lived in, taught, and ministered in an agricultural society. In the lifetime, or in his lifetime, it says, the greater majority of the Israelites in Palestine were poor. There was a small middle class composed primarily of craftsmen and merchants, but the wealthy, they were just small in number, and most of them were in the elite. We could use that word. In some instances, some of them would have been the kings or been some kind of high government official. But society depended on agriculture. And people today don't understand how dependent we are on agriculture. I mean, right now, as I drive up and down the road, there's wheat that needs cut. I mean, it's the heads have drooped and it needs cut. Well, why do I know about that? Because I grew up in this country. I know about wheat farming. I know about, don't tell anybody, but I know just enough about cotton to say I like cotton clothes, all right? That's all I want to know about cotton. I don't want to know how to chop it. I don't want to know how to pick it, even though I probably could if I had to. The thing about it is, when we look at the shepherd, we understand that, and it's important. And as Jesus was bringing this illustration to the people, they would have understood it also. It notes here 4 basic agricultural factors made a year good or bad economically. It says they were A, the grain crops, which were enough grain to produce adequate bread. They didn't have the opportunity to ship wheat or rye or barley or whatever they were making their bread of from across the world. It had to be raised in that local area. And we all know right now, today, that we have a good wheat crop out there. They can't get in the fields because it's too wet. And you can't cut the wheat with this high humidity because that wheat has to come in. I probably shouldn't do a percentage, but it's like 10%. If it's over 10%, they won't accept it. Sometimes it needs to be lower than that for it to go into the granary, or it will spoil. It'll go bad. Well, it's not happening. And here's the sad thing: there's a lot of places north of us have had those terrible hailstorms. One hailstorm can wipe out a wheat crop. One hailstorm. They're promising today. Oh, folks, tonight might be a booger. They're promising hail the size of softballs and bigger today. Yeah, that's not good. Night before last, they had hail balls the size of grapefruit that were wind driven in tornadoes. Night before last in that storm. So that could wipe out our crop. Well, if we relied totally on our local food source, we wouldn't have bread for the rest of the year because we plant wheat in the fall and it grows all winter and we harvest it in June. So we're reliant upon that grain crop, and all grain crops are the same way. Corn, any kind of grain crop or any kind of crop along that line. B, it says here, the olive crop, used basically for daily existence. In the Middle East over there where Jesus was, that was important. You had to have that olive oil. They used that stuff for everything, and people still use it today. The vineyards. If you didn't have a grape crop, you didn't have the wine. You didn't have those things to drink. Now, it's always been noted that the water was not that good over in that area, and they would put a little bit of that into the water to make it where one could drink it. So without the vineyards doing well, you had nothing to drink. I mean, you was in trouble. He also knowed the birth weight and the survival of lambs. If we don't have livestock, what are we going to eat? You know, a lot of people nowadays are raising fryer chickens. I know the kids, they bought, I don't know how many fryer chickens that they've ended up with this year. I'm guessing probably 50 or so that they've butchered and put up. And I remember when we were younger that we would do those kinds of things. Now, of recent, we've had pigs that we've raised. You know, y'all know that. We've had pigs and we butcher them and we put them in the freezer. And my neighbor has some of the nicest looking heifers. Nice looking heifers. And Linda says, you cannot go under that fence. Leave them heifers alone. But we got places here around us and further north of us that raise cattle for beef. And we have goats and all of those things. But if they have no babies, or if they lose that crop, we're in trouble. We have nothing to eat. So that's why it is so imperative that we take care of these things. It notes down here the shepherd served an essential role in the family's prosperity and social well being. He led the sheep to adequate grazing, made sure they grew, had something to eat, led the sheep to adequate water. Animals have to have water. And these sheep, they would go along and they went to different tanks that they would have water in. Keep the sheep from predators. And, a lot of people I've noticed have these livestock guardian dogs now for their sheep and goats and chickens and all of those kind of things. Why? Because of predation. Now, when Linda and I had the pigs there on the ranch, I wasn't so worried about predation, and we've got coyotes and raccoons and all kinds of critters. Bobcats come through once in a while. But the pigs, they didn't bother the pigs. They were afraid of the pigs. Pigs, predation on pigs would be something along the side of feral dogs, something like that. But a lot of people have donkeys for that. But here, Jesus is talking about keeping things safe from predators. And I think about, as I was reading through this, that as God's children, we have a responsibility to keep one another from spiritual predators, false teachers, because they are in abundance. There's plenty of them out there. It also to give special care to the weak and the sick. If we have an animal that is sick or weak, we do whatever we can. I don't know if any of you guys have ever had a calf or a pig or a goat or or a chicken or whatever brought into the house because it was sick. Our daughter's all the time bringing in some critter that's sick. And she's got a little place back there that she puts it, and she doctors it and takes care of it. And we always give them the vaccinations they need. Some of us have worked cattle and all of those kinds of things. We take care of their physical needs. Also, we need to keep, as God's children, we need to think about the spiritual needs. Make sure people who are physically or spiritually sick or weak receive what they need. He notes here in our outline, his whole existence focuses on the welfare of the sheep. And Jesus, that was his focus. He was serving the sheep. He was taking care of their well-being. He'd give them proper care. The sheepfold was an enclosure that it notes here in this context. Only had one entrance. I think that's interesting there. One way in, one way out. And Jesus took care of that. He was making sure that they were safe. And as God's children, we need to make sure that we're safe, one another, from these predators that might be out there trying to attack us, the flock, if you will. Continuing on, it says, on occasion it was necessary for the shepherd to leave the flock overnight. And when they did, they would put them into a large sheepfold to keep the flocks. There was always someone there to keep them and to watch over them during the night. The shepherd would come in of a morning and would call his sheep out. And the sheep knew him. They had a very tight relationship. And if you've ever had, now I've never had sheep, we had some goats. But usually if you have animals that you're close to, you can call them by name and they'll come to you. And I've seen people with cattle that they named. I've seen cattle that you couldn't get close to them if you tried, but they were pretty wild. Our pigs, we had them all named. And you could go down there and say, get over here, whichever one it was. And we had one old sow, she was named Old Red. And Old Red, come over here. And she'd come over there, she's like a dog. Now, I've had pigs that you couldn't do that to. they'd eat you up. But ours was that tame. These sheep knew their names. They knew who they were to follow. And it was that repetitious thing. As spiritually, we follow Jesus. Jesus knows our name. And if we are his children, our name are written in the book of life. Continuing down here, it says some basic lessons Jesus reveals about the nature and quality of his service are not obvious to many Christians. And again, there are people out there that, like I said, in our viewing audience, that might not know about a shepherd. They might not know about taking care of animals like we do here in the rural area. But when we think about what Jesus did, it is truly important to understand Jesus gave his all for us. For us. So let's look at John chapter 10, starting there in verse 1. John chapter 10, starting there in verse 1. It says, truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs in some other way, he is a thief and a robber. You know, I look at verse 1 there, and I know it doesn't start in our outline with verse 1, but the person who owns the sheep, the shepherd, he comes in the front door. He doesn't sneak in to steal away those sheep that are not his. And that's physically speaking. But spiritually speaking, when we think about the false teacher, we think about the individual who comes in and they are trying to encourage, manipulate others away from God's truth. That's the one that comes in the other way spiritually. They're a thief. They're stealing a soul from God and taking it and giving it to Satan. And folks, that can be a reality anywhere that we live. So the one who enters by the door of the fold of the sheep, that's the shepherd, verse 2. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. He's up front. He comes in. He takes care of them. They know him, as we will see here in just a moment. Spiritually, it's the same way. We need to look at the one that is leading us in God's truth, because constantly Satan is there like a roaring lion seeking those in whom he can devour. In number 1, in our outline, it says the sheep know the shepherd so well they recognize his voice. And number 2 says the shepherd knows the sheep so well that he calls them by name. And in verse 3 it says, to him the doorkeeper opens and the sheep hear his voice. And he calls his own sheep by his name and leads them out. An animal that you get, I don't care what kind of animal it is, let's say, for instance, you get a puppy. It doesn't take very long for that puppy to know your voice and will bond with you. If you're the one that's taking care of it and training it and doing all these things for it, that puppy will bond to you. Even an older dog will, if you're the one taking care of it. If I'm at the house and I go out in the yard, I guarantee you Lola will be right there jumping this high off the ground because she is so excited that we're there. And Linda too. Linda goes out there. She's excited. That's our dog. But now somebody else come up. No, We're sitting over putting the evil eye on them. We're watching them, see what's going on here. And you guys know that. Any kind of animal's that way. The doorkeeper opens, the sheep hears his voice and calls the sheep by name and leads them out. That's the way Jesus is. We hear Jesus from his inspired word today. And in essence, he is the one in which we follow. In number 3, it says, even when other flocks and shepherd leads, not drives, his sheep out of the sheepfold, because they trust him and his care, the sheep follow him. In verses 3 and 4 here of John chapter 10, it says, to him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hears his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out and puts forth all his own. He goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. Have you ever been listening to a video or an audio or something, and you don't know the individual personally, but as they go through and they're teaching, it doesn't take very long that you know that, hey, that guy's teaching the truth. He must be a Christian. You ever done that? I've done that a lot. I know what he's teaching up there, and I know how he's teaching it. I know what the Bible says. This is somebody to listen to. The alternative is also very true. Now, I want us to go down to verse 11. You can go back and look at the rest of this after a while if you so desire. I'd encourage that. The good shepherd will die for his sheep. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Jesus takes care of us. He's given us what we need spiritually. He takes care of our needs, as we have read in the Gospels. And he died for us. He died for us. A shepherd back in this time period would have stood off a predator that was coming in to kill the sheep. The crook that we see, shepherds, the staff and crook, that was to fight off predators. It was also used to work the sheep, catch them, whatever, but it was to fight off predators. And they would stand between the sheep and, say, the wolf, and they would fight that wolf off. Now, we think about spiritually. Jesus fought off the wolf of Satan by dying on the cross for us. In that example, should we not give our all to keep the flock safe from the wolves in sheep's clothing that are out there all over the world? I think we should. I think we have an obligation as Christians to do that. Number 5 said, when facing danger, a hired person will save himself rather than the sheep. In verse 12, John chapter 10, it says, he who is a hired hand and not the shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and not concerned about the sheep. The hired hand is not invested in the sheep. Jesus invested everything in his children, in the Christians. He invested his life. He left that heavenly abode, came into this world, died on a cross. He invested everything in us. But the hired hand that does not have an investment Are they going to take on the danger of standing for the flock? According to this, they flee. Hey, these aren't mine. I'm not giving my life for them. I'm not going to get hurt because of them. Well, as God's children, we need to invest in one another. We need to invest in one another. And when the false teacher comes along, we need to work together to make sure that false teacher does not lead astray maybe some of the weak souls that are among us. The hired person, no investment. We have to be invested in one another. In verses 14 through 18, it says Jesus willingly, on his own initiative, died to save the sheep. He says, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep which are not in this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it again. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down. I have authority to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father. Jesus was willing to give it all for the sheep, for the sheep, and he did. He gave it all for them. He didn't even think twice. And it was his choice, his own initiative. It was his choice to do so. So we think about what this teaches us, and I know there's a whole lot more that we could note within this. But the sheep of the time were the Jews and the Gentiles that Jesus died for. For today, it's us as his children. And you can look and think about some of the lessons that we learn from this. And as I think about Jesus's example, that we too should be shepherds for one another and keep one another safe. Make sure that we're fed with the right thing. You know, we need to be fed by God's truth spiritually. How many of you guys, if you've got a dog, how many of you guys go buy goat feed for your dog? You wouldn't, would you? You go buy dog food because that's what they need. As Christians, we need to give people the spiritual food that they need, and it's from God's truth. It's not from some false writing, whatever century it might have been written in, or by whom it had been written in, or by whom it might be accepted by. We need to stick with the Bible. Feed people the Bible. Make sure that if there is a weakness, that we help strengthen that weakness in one another. Because that's imperative that we do so. Because precious souls are at stake. And I would suggest we all need a shepherd. We all need help. And we are so blessed that Jesus is our good shepherd. We'll talk a little bit more about spiritual success and distress next Lord's Day morning, if he wills.